What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital covered rules. My mother, sister and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 am the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes, and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital, and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there, and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read. Not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours, and as far back as I could scroll, he was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on. Why was he in the etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her via DMS and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died, and dating someone younger than his grandchildren. Someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a shitty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic for one, but not for another. I was adopted and told a silly, magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true, even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother. She died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone, and I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory, and was raped by an orderly, and she discovered she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. The amount of comments highlighting sexual abuse is grossly disheartening. I hope those who survived such things find healing in the midst of piecing things together. An uncle beat a guy almost to death with his bare hands. He had walked in on a friend molesting a kid. He had to pay a fine and do community service for a long time, but also didn't have to pay for beer at the local bar for a few months. He was so reserved and kind, so it threw me when I found out what he'd accomplished in his younger years. The reason grandma moved away when my dad was still a baby to a big city more than 3 days away from her family was because she stabbed her stepfather and almost killed him. It was a very small village. Later she told me he was a rapist. She didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the convo with "I did the right thing." We never met her side of the family. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back, to be closer with her. After about a year, we had no real ties to the state we had tried out. So we said screw it. Let's go back. She's basically family. We were also happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked, and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us. That if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her, and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues, and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts, and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm, and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything, and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now BTW. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was raped by her uncle, my great uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the S of the family. My dad's side as garbage. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO for a major Heath fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the Heath Fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also, based on these claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application, but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. My grandmother was married for over 50 years and never saw my grandfather's penis. That my mom cheated on my dad for 20 years and still hasn't told him to this day. I'm still trying to figure out what to do and how to go about the situation and exposing the truth about her to my dad, but I'm afraid he would die of a broken heart. Worst thing is, she cheated with my godfather, who used to come to the house and drink coffee with my mom and dad every day. As a kid who found out that one parent was cheating on the other, there is no good time to tell them. My brother, 14, and I, 18, both discovered that our dad was cheating on our mom separately and kept putting off telling her for over a year because it was Christmas, and then she had a business trip, and then it was her birthday, and then it was this, and then it was that, etc. One day, I got in trouble and my dad said, "You're a disgrace to this family," and out flew the words that he and mom were not prepared for. I know it's hard. I know it will change everything if you tell your dad or confront your mom. Just wanted to give you some solidarity. One of my best friends was caught trying to meet up with a 13-year-old and was filmed and uploaded to YouTube. Was he by chance going to get a cupcake? A former friend of mine from childhood was a youth pastor at a summer church camp. Turns out he was grooming young girls and teens both at camp and online after camp was over. Only reason I found out was back in 2011. He was in his late 20s at the time. One of the girls told her parents and the cops posed as her online while he masturbated into a webcam. The cop then convinced him to drive 3 hours to go meet and hook up. When he showed up at the girl's place in the middle of the night, the cops were waiting and arrested him. He's now a convicted sex offender and did time in jail. The crazy part? Once he got out, he moved to Texas and married a divorcee that had kids. He's also now the dean of online studies at his church and is responsible for growing the number of students taking classes online. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5. For context, one day when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was going a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the sex offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now, and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. My uncle was arrested for a cold case rape/murder from 1972. He always seemed like a nice guy. Shot himself in the head right before sentencing. https://www.cnn.com/2020/11/10/us/1972 killing Terrence Miller dies trnd/index. HTML. When I was 17, I dated someone who told me when he was drunk that not only would he probably hit me one day and just wanted me to be prepared, but he also used to rape his little brother. Every now and then I remember that moment and it just floors me how dangerous that kid was. Found a scrapbook of my mom and a guy I didn't recognize from her immediately post-college days. Turns out he was a long-term boyfriend of hers who killed himself when she broke up with him. My grandfather found his body, I learned at age 20, by finding the book/shrine to him. When my grandfather passed away, we discovered that he did not exist. His name was not in any government registry. He was a normal citizen, paid taxes, had a license and everything, lived a long life, married to my grandmother for over 50 years, had multiple children. Everything normal, still to now. No one knows who he really was and why he had a false name. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano/sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards/money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. F you, Emily. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it and found a pair of binoculars, sitting straight forward and lifting the binoculars to her eyes. She saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a peeping Tom, well, it had to come down with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple trees. Bent the fucker to complete uselessness. I got an angry call the next day. Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday? Fuck yeah, I did. That was your uncle's, her mother's brother. Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored the issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old tree house out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice it to say, I have written off most of that side of the family. Edit. The uncle in question is now dead. Died 6/16. To be clear, are you saying that your cousin's father was spying on her? The kid that bullied me in grade 5 and 6. Turns out his father was molesting him and his brother throughout their childhood. Met a super nice guy at a networking event when I just starting out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was a nice family man. Super rich. Eventually we became friends and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, etc. He had the demeanor and looked like Al Boland from Home Improvement. To give you an idea, like 4 years later I was looking at the sex offender registry map for my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s he was convicted of co-running a commercial child porn sales site. Served 5 years for it in federal prison.